Carol, thank you for that very lovely introduction. I really wouldn't be here, not just today, without Carol Willis's help, but also Skyscraper Rivals owes so much to her scholarship in writing those skyscrapers and her help along the way as it was written. So I'm very pleased, and I'm glad too that Carol was able to give you a little bit of a background about my interests in Wall Street's architecture. As Carol mentioned, I've written a book about the Bank of England, and a book about Wall Street, and now I'm writing a book about the idea of obsolescence in 20th century architecture, the idea that the built environment can lose its value or usefulness very unpredictably and rapidly, resulting in the idea of expendable buildings. Because these three projects, these three book projects in a way, are kind of an unintended trilogy on capitalism in architecture, from 18th century England up through 20th century Manhattan, and then the idea of obsolescence is one that really is global. And so I'll begin by framing my talk today with kind of what, for me, remain interesting questions about Wall Street. As Carol said, this was a book that I finished almost 10 years ago and have moved on in some ways from it. So if my memory is a little spotty when it comes to questions, I might have to look at a copy of the book to remember some things. But what remains interesting to me is about Wall Street is the questions that we can ask about what sort of a place is it that capitalism builds for itself? Or what sort of a place is it that capitalism inhabits? And how, which this exhibit shows best of all, I think, more than my book, which is just a snapshot, could do, is how does a place adapt itself to the requirements of capitalism? And I think just to start off, I mean, by capitalism I mean something very simple. That is an economic system which gives priority to decisions made by individuals or corporations and towards those individual or corporations' profits, as opposed to another economic system that you can imagine in which the state or the public interest makes decisions and profits. And capitalism, as it has evolved, has certain characteristic features. How to take a bit of money, turn it into a commodity that you can sell, and then turn that commodity back into profit. And this gives capitalism also some of its other characteristic features that historians have talked about for a long time. It's restlessness, the constant search for growth and expansion, this dynamism, and as in the 20th century an economic historian named Joseph Schumpeter wrote, its tendency towards creative destruction. That is, once you've created an enterprise, or you've created a commodity that you sell, something better comes along and you innovate, and that innovation supersedes what had come before and destroys it, but that's the mechanism, that's the logic of capitalism as it does this. So my interest remains how does the built environment both reflect what might be going on economically and socially, but also how might the built environment itself structure the way that this economic system works, and what might looking at architecture tell us about capitalism that perhaps other ways of looking at history might not tell us. So those are kind of the larger questions that hopefully I'll come back around to in the end of my talk today. I have about 40, 45 minutes, Carol? Okay. Got 5 minutes under my belt already. So, as you know, if you've had a chance to look through this exhibition, that Wall Street's development physically was a kind of a succession of kind of crops, to use a natural metaphor. That is, low buildings, 5 or 6 story ones from the mid-19th century, then being superseded in the early, from the 1870s to 1880s, the first skyscraper crop, buildings about 12 stories high. Then in the 1890s, buildings rise up to about 20 stories in height. Then in the 1900s, you start to have larger lots which so many of the illustrations here show so well. Largely lots being kind of put together to make larger buildings. And then the tallest building by about 1912 is the Bankers Trust Building, about 500 feet tall. So when you get to around 1924, this is the way that Wall Street looks. Certain factors come along in the teens and the 20s to set up this explosion in the 1920s of skyscraper design. In the mid-19-teens, zoning regulations are established in New York City, which establish this basic profile of the classic New York skyscraper, a base up to a certain height which can reach out to the sidewalk, then the desire for setbacks, that is the public interest impinging on private property, set the public interest for light and air down on the street, creating these setbacks, and then a tower that can rise basically as high as Carol has suggested today and elaborated so well in her own book, Form Follows Finance, as high as economically allowable. And so you have this really extraordinary explosion of building in the Wall Street area, really in the space of about 6 years. In 1925, the skyline of Lower Manhattan looks like this. The Woolworth Building to the north is by far the tallest structure. There's the Bankers Trust Building here, the Singer Tower there, the Equitable Building on Broadway there. We can see a new building starting to come up here. 6 years later, I tried to scale these drawings roughly the same. Woolworth Tower has been dwarfed by a series of new office towers around Wall Street. And as Carol said, I focused my attention on 4 of them before. The 2 off of Wall Street are the City Service Building on Pine Street and Citibank Farmers Trust Building south of Wall Street. I will only briefly mention those later. So you have this extraordinary situation, and I think one needs to understand, first of all, why this happened, and then, puzzlingly, why it continues a couple of years after the crash on Wall Street, why these buildings are not being finished until 1930-31. There was a great office market shortage in Lower Manhattan, in which 500,000 people were commuting every day. Up through 1931, the occupancy rates still were as high as 96 to 99%. So this was an area that was just begging for more development. There was money to be made. It was only in May 1931 did the occupancy rate dip below 90%. So the office market was very resilient in Lower Manhattan, even as the rest of the national economy was starting to crash. There was a great demand for office space because in the 7 years of prosperity between 1922 and 29, there had been a great consolidation in the banking industry. Banks of a certain size were gobbling up smaller banks. That meant their office staff was increasing. They needed more lawyers and accountants working for them. So there were more people coming to work in Wall Street. Also, you had holding companies starting to headquarter themselves on Wall Street. So the City Service Company is not a bank. It was the predecessor of Citgo. It was essentially an energy company. But because it was also a financial company, it headquartered itself here. So you not just have banks, but you have these industrial holding companies located here seeking office space. And so you have then, these are the kind of the basic economic reasons for these large buildings coming about, both being put up as headquarters, but also really primarily as investments. Even when these buildings, as we'll see, have a name of a company attached to them, the company would typically occupy only a fraction of the space, and they knew that, and they were building up basically to make money. So these buildings are about that capitalist process of taking money, constructing a commodity, which in this case happens to be space, within a building, and turning it into more money. It's not simply about prestige of having a tall tower in which to occupy some of the best property. So what we have created then is this iconic skyline of Lower Manhattan. I think if there's an image that's from this time period on for the last 90 years has come to stand for New York City. And we can think of New York City as kind of the capital of the 20th century. If there's one city that epitomizes that century, it's this. And that's what we have here. And so what's interesting about it, I think, is the anonymity of the buildings. These are not buildings that are as individually famous as the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building. Rather, it is the ensemble of them all together that is that image. And in some ways, what historians understand it, a wonderful exhibition like this starts to kind of unpack those individual buildings and give them back their own specific histories, and that, in many ways, was what the book Skyscraper Rivals was about, which was to give an identity to these individual buildings without denying the fact that what we still have here is a collection and a skyline, and not monumental, individualized objects. And I think one experiences Wall Street that way, even walking down there. As Carol said, it's a wall, literally, of buildings there, not freestanding monumental objects. And even from a distance, we see it that way altogether. So my brief for today was to focus on Wall Street's buildings, and I'll talk then about two of the most spectacular skyscrapers built, 40 Wall Street and then 1 Wall Street. And I'll use these to talk in general about how skyscrapers were built and constructed, who some of the characteristic individuals were who were part of that process. So here's a map from the 1920s. This is Wall Street through the center of it, Broadway down along here, Pine Street, running along there, and Pearl Street here. The first building I'm going to talk about today is 40 Wall Street, which occupies several lots right in this mid-block area here, right there. And then later I'll bring this up again, and 1 Wall Street is here at the intersection of Wall Street and Broadway. I'll start with the person whose idea this really was. This is a developer named George Orstrom, a young man who's 1930s, an investment banker, a pilot, very dashing, a pilot in World War I, a very dashing man from Greenwich, Connecticut. And his idea was to make more money. So he put together a development consortium that also included the builder William A. Starrett, who was head of a major construction company. And it was their idea to put up a building as big and as quick and as cheaply as possible to make as much money as they could. As they were, and this is very typical of Wall Street development, that these are developers' ideas, and then they go around looking for tenants, and they happen to, but the Bank of the Manhattan Company, which already occupied a building on that site, went in the development consortium, agreed to be the major client, but would not let Orstrom use their name in raising the financing. They specifically told them that he couldn't leverage their good name to go around begging for money for this. Only after all the money was in place did it start to be referred to as the Bank of the Manhattan Company building. So again, what I want to establish is that even though it was known for a long time as the Bank of the Manhattan Company building, it was constructed, it was a developer's project, and Orstrom was the lead developer for it. As the site became larger, the building became higher. Always one of the restrictions in building a tall skyscraper was you had to have enough elevators in it so that people could get up to their offices quickly enough. And the larger the elevator core, the less rentable area you had around it. So to build high, you needed it to be big on the bottom. So the bigger this building got on the bottom, the higher it could be erected. One other feature about it worth mentioning is that the financing for this was largely borrowed money, 6% mortgage bonds, which, not to get too far ahead of the story, by 1935, Orstrom wasn't able to pay and the building went into default very rapidly. This, I want too to say, is very characteristic of these buildings. They were speculations, and there was no guarantee that the original builder or the owner was going to be able to hold on to it. And in the middle of the Depression, it wasn't until after the Second World War, I think, that the building actually got full occupancy. This is a progress schedule, and here in the exhibition you can see an original image of this. The building was built in record time. It took about a year to do this. And here is a list on the left-hand column of all the different trades involved, and then from May until April of the following year, what months they were going to be on site working. And so this had to be very, very carefully mapped out because with all that borrowed money at stake, the developer needed to open the building as quickly as possible, because every day that that building wasn't open and he was paying interest on it, they were losing money. So this building was known for its speed as well as for its height. At one point in May 1930, 4 floors were going up per week. And this a building similar to the Empire State Building, and that desire to move as quickly as possible. Here, then, is a view of it. Once it was completed, you see it rising up from that large square, more or less square tower, the setbacks rising up to that square tower, and what was called a kind of French Gothic pinnacle on top. We'll see a detail of that in a few moments. Here is the base of it. I should have said, before I got further along here, who the architects were of this. There was a whole group of architects involved, and this had to do with the fact that there were a lot of different clients. The lead architect is usually kind of the manager of the project. It was a man named H. Craig Severance. He had been a partner of William Van Allen, the architect of the Chrysler Building. He was more kind of a business manager, and he was working primarily for Orstrom. Then there was a Japanese-born architect named Yasuo Matsui, who had trained as an architect at MIT, and he had been an architect working closely with the Starrett construction company. So Matsui was in the team doing a lot of the design, but also, one presumes, kind of meeting the needs of another member of the development consortium. We can see at the base of the building here that it has a very kind of traditional classical design, a heavy stone base topped by these fluted pilasters. We can't see it very well here, but there's a sculpture by the sculptor Eli Nadelman here depicting Oceanus. The reason that there is this mythological god of water here is the Bank of the Manhattan Company in the early 19th century was originally a water company, or at least it was founded to finance water projects, so that this figure of Oceanus appeared on their stock certificates and was kind of a symbol here. So this was meant to symbolize the fact that this prestigious financial corporation was the prime tenant of this building. That classical base was one that observers at the time took note seemed to be derived from its neighbor, the Customs House building right next door, that great Doric temple. And this artist, a Russian artist, W.K. Olterjevsky, called this rendering of his from 1931 the Temples of Commerce. So it's meant, interestingly, to kind of link tradition and modernity, because it makes the Customs House look like a streamlined, modern 1920s building, but at the same time, it traditionalizes this building too and makes it seem like a massive stone masonry construction. So this is one of the tropes of people talking about architecture at this time, that it's both modern and traditional, that there's a fluid boundary between these two styles. And we certainly see that at the base of 40 Wall Street. As the building moves up, it becomes brick. It becomes much more stripped down. There's very little ornamentation to the building whatsoever until you get to that top where, as I mentioned before, it's a copper-clad, kind of Gothicized, pitched roof, lots of dormer windows, and a finial up on top. There were some small rooms up here, but basically that was unoccupied. When we think about the whole of the structure, I think that what we have stylistically is a very disjointed composition. On the base, classical, up through the shaft, very utilitarian, and then up on the top, very French Gothic. We can think about what that might mean. I think part of it is a kind of a reflection of the disjointedness in the authorship of the design. You had several different architects working there. This was about making money. You don't have a sense that the architects were driving the project or the design, that they kind of pieced it together. And you'll see in a moment that it consists of even many other pieces stylistically within the building itself. Here was a bank hall, not on the ground floor, but up a level. This was designed by yet another architect, Morrell Smith, a New York architect, and he was working for the Bank of the Manhattan Company. He was kind of their, he worked in private practice, but he did a lot of work for them. And here, we see this kind of Renaissance stone arched style. This was typically for the banks, there would be a kind of the headquarters branch office, the headquarters banking hall here. And then towards the back, what was called the officer's platform overlooking Wall Street, where the loan officers would meet with clients. So I wanted to show you a little bit of the type of work that would be taking place here. A public banking hall, a more private area, perhaps for clients of kind of a higher level to come and meet with the bank officers. As you moved up the building, here was the boardroom for the Bank of the Manhattan Company, based on the signer's room at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The company had a very strong colonial era identity for itself because of its founding at that time. And so Morrell Smith built themselves this replica room encased within this modern steel glass abstracted construction. You see what I mean by the bits and pieces. Then Yasuo Matsui designed the luncheon club in kind of an English rustic lodge type of a style here. So think of these places as kind of fantasy buildings inside with a great variety of styles there. Most of the floors of the building, though, would have looked something like this. This isn't actually an interior from 40 Wall Street. I don't think in my researches, and I've never seen any pictures of how the work actually took place here, but this is pretty typical. Broad, open-span floor spaces in which a tremendous amount of clerical work was being done, now more and more automated, tending in the 1920s to be done more and more by women as well. So on the one hand, you have kind of a male executive and male clients, and yet the occupants of this building, and this building had 10,000 people working in it at a time. 10,000 people here, you'd have to imagine that a fairly substantial number of them were women coming in and doing this basic clerical work in these massed settings, this kind of industrialized setting of clerical labor. These were the accounting departments, the clerical departments. If there was an insurance company, it might occupy the space here. I should say something then about the tenants of 40 Wall Street. As I said at the beginning, buildings like this were not built to be occupied by a single enterprise, a single corporation. So there were many, many tenants here. There were about half kind of the building directories of this time indicate that there was about half lawyers in here. The closer that you got to the stock exchange, the more you had bankers, brokerage houses. Merrill Lynch was located here. The Bank of China was in 40 Wall Street. Businesses that had specifically to do with the stock exchange. But there were also industrial corporations here. Phillips Dodge, the copper mining company, had an office here, as well as Electric Boat, the submarine builder, had an office in 40 Wall Street. So again, what I want to emphasize here is that Wall Street is not simply about high finance, but it's about industry. As we see when we get to 1 Wall Street, Brooks Brothers had an office there. So what we want to understand is that this really was a world and microcosm of American business, and not simply financial services or banks. So I'll say a word then a little bit about the general geography of Wall Street too, because I did want to show you a little bit more of from the whole financial district. So there's 40 Wall Street here. So on the map in the center, you tended to have those financial services and lawyers. Up towards the north here, and even off the top of this map above Maiden Lane, tend to be an insurance district. And then off to the sides, very rapidly, as soon as you move west and east, financial services firms dropped out, and it tended to be more businesses that catered to the docks, commodities traders, brokerages for that. So again, I think as we look here and we learn more about the details of Wall Street's history, not just architecturally, we want to do that economically as well. That there were a tremendous variety of enterprises working in Lower Manhattan, and that they had their own neighborhoods and their own geography. So again, even though we see this as one kind of massed whole, as you look into the detail, there's great variety and also a rationality and an order to it as well. I want to talk a little bit about the afterlife of 40 Wall Street. If you walk down 40 Wall Street today, you see it's known as the Trump Building. In between now and then, when I first started talking about it, it had some some episodes in it that brought the building to attention in the mid-1940s. An Air Force plane crashed into it, which caused a sensation at the time. As I said before, the building went into bankruptcy in 1935. It was famous for that. It was seen as being a kind of an example of the excesses of real estate speculation. Imelda Marcos owned the building briefly in the 1980s. It came out that some frontmen had purchased it for her, and then Donald Trump ended up with it. And so what we see here is a building that's also characteristic, I think, of many buildings in Wall Street. That is a rapid changeover in ownership, happening within 4 or 5 years after it was initially built, going through economic problems, constantly, again, this kind of churning of creative destruction, not of the building itself, but of the financial, those who are trying to take financial advantage of it, not being able to hold on to the site, speculating on it, having to turn it over to someone else, constantly searching for that way to maximize the value in this particular location within this building. What can we say then, I think, about 40 Wall Street as a whole at this point? It stands for me as one of these dynamic, risky speculators projects, striving to make as much money as quickly as possible, bringing a lot of parties to the table, both in terms of the development aspect of it, but also the architects as well. And I think that gives you then the disjointedness in its style. I think there's a way to let this building illustrate for us the way in which Wall Street is put together through a myriad of actors, even in an individual site, and in some ways the inability to keep the whole together, a lacking of kind of an integration in the building as well. And that's part of its dynamism and part of its risk, and also the possibility for reward as well. The risk is spread amongst many people, the reward is spread amongst many people, but that disjointedness is present, remains present in the architecture itself. Move on to my second example of One Wall Street. Occupied what was widely considered to be the most prestigious site on Wall Street. At the intersection of Broadway and of Wall Street, across the street from Trinity Church. This makes a nice counterexample for us today, because in many ways it was, we can think of it as kind of the opposite in certain regards to 40 Wall Street. One way to think about it is, whereas 40 Wall Street was primarily a speculation and profit-driven project, One Wall Street was primarily a prestige project for the Irving Trust Company. The Irving Trust Company was one of these banks that in the 1920s was consolidating, and in doing so it enlarged its office staff, and it outgrown the offices that it occupied in the Woolworth Building. So it already was associated with a very prestigious architectural monument, and then decided to move down Broadway and buy up this prestigious site. So all along, as they said, as one of the presidents said, was they were looking for a masterpiece and not just a building. George Orstrom would never have said that about 40 Wall Street, but from the very beginning, Irving Trust was looking for an architectural masterpiece. They wanted to make money off of it too. They spent a lot of money on the site, but they wanted something more out of that. At the same time, It was a corporation, and it was a bureaucracy, and this is a diagram showing the Directors Building Committee. It starts out with some directors and works its way down to all of the different officers involved and all of the different components of the building. I know you're not able to decipher this, and I can't either. Here it's pixelated, but you can imagine there are people working on publicity. There was a publicity department for this building. They wanted to attract the most attention to it. One of their greatest publicity stunts here was when the riveting was very loud. They wrote letters to all the neighbors apologizing for this. Never been done before, and they made sure that the local newspapers knew about it. So of course they picked up that Irving Trust was so considerate of its neighbors. So this was one of the ways that Irving Trust organized itself, not just to build a building efficiently and economically, but for them, publicity, good publicity was part of the economics of it as well. Harry Ward, who was the president of Irving Trust at this time, and I would identify as the client, had been educated at Yale. His family was an old New York family. He was involved in a lot of historical societies. So what I want to emphasize here is that you have individuals involved who bring their own agendas and priorities. And here you had one person who, even though he worked within a corporate structure, was able to stamp his own particular interests in the history of the site, in the desire to create a masterpiece here. They also went after the best architect they thought they could find at the time. An architect named Ralph Walker, and I couldn't help but add this alleged quote about Walker from Frank Lloyd Wright, the only other architect in America, Wright apparently said about Walker, though I've never seen, I have no idea where this came from except from Walker's obituaries. But what this lets you know a little bit is that this was a very highly regarded architect who was the lead designer here. He had been educated at Columbia, had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, and saw himself as, he said, he called himself the analyst of beauty. He worked in a large firm, and other people did lots of things, but his idea was that even though the final design, as Walker said, is the work of many minds, he wanted to really think about the aesthetics of the design. He was assisted by a Columbia graduate named Harry Coke Smith. So these are, in my mind, kind of the two primary designers here. The firm, Voorhees, Mellon and Walker, is now HLW International, so it continues to be a leading New York firm. Very careful studies done of this building. So here are some of the massing studies. As the financing calculations changed, the building's height rose and shrunk and went up and down, but you can see them playing with the possibilities of how to handle the base and where to locate the tower on it. So what I want to emphasize here is the great care that went into the designing of this building from the architect's perspective. And especially down at the base. If you've been by One Wall Street, it has a very characteristic fluting and a very complicated rhythm of fluting as it turns the corner from Broadway onto Wall Street here. And this was what Walker paid a great deal of attention to. What he wanted to do was to create, he wanted the wall to represent what it was. It was a curtain wall. That is, the steel frame was holding the building up, the wall was hanging from that frame. And he wanted to give it that sense of a continuous curtain. And he also wanted it to be aesthetically interesting and very visually dynamic. He said that the vital part of architecture is not structure, but shelter. He wasn't a hardcore modernist who wanted to express structure, but he wanted something that enclosed. It is a place in which to be physically comfortable and mentally happy. He saw this building's facade as being a mental escape for, as he saw it, those kind of workers in Wall Street almost driven to neuroses by the pressures of their jobs. And that to look at a building that almost had this kind of naturalistic wave to it, a rhythm, or almost a musical rhythm. This could be, as he said, recreation for the mind, not easily read at a glance so that it engaged you, not like something simple like 40 Wall Street. He wanted it to be like an imitation of nature, an ever-changing light and pattern. So he draped it in this textured fluted limestone curtain wall. An image of it like this. This was a very unusual design and hard for people to appreciate. The architectural critic, Louis Mumford, was very dismissive of this. He called it mere swank. It was just a decoration for him. I think it shows us the limits of Mumford's capacity as a critic, that he could only appreciate a building for its bare expression of its structure. And he couldn't relate to a building that was modernist in certain respects in its abstraction, in its sense of a curtain wall, but also deeply traditional. Because just like an older building has a facade in front of the building, an ideal representation of it, this too building is traditional, not simply in its limestone expression and the fact that it has vertical windows, but in effect it wraps a facade around the building, even though it's an abstract one. I focus upon this because I want to emphasize just how much that Wall Street deserves a place, as architectural historians have said before, in the pantheon of great architecture as design, and not simply as an engineering or an economic feat. So there's some details of the finish. Its fluting and its verticality, also echoing, as this photograph on the left shows, Trinity Church here. This is its relationship to history, not as literal as 40 Wall Street, where you have that classical colonnade, but now something more abstract. Gothic not in its ornamentation, but in its verticality. Its planning, in some ways, was very typical for a Wall Street skyscraper, banks of elevators surrounded by more or less open floors that we can see the structural columns. Though here, when we look to see what we're being told here, is that there were separate elevators for the bank's officers and customers and separate for the tenants of the building. This was very much seen as a two-part building. One, the prestige headquarters for the Irving Trust, another one for the people who perhaps Irving Trust felt were lucky enough to be able to be tenants in this building. So there's a segregation in this building by occupants. The lobby was this beautiful lobby by one of Ralph Walker's collaborators, an artist named Hildreth Mayer, who designed this a kind of a mural up on top called the Allegory of Wealth and Beauty. In effect, what it is a plea on the part of all of the financiers and businessmen occupying this building to take their wealth and to turn it into beauty. It's a circular design here. The idea is that wealth that the pursuit of money is not enough, that wealth only achieves its true purpose if it's transfigured into beauty. And you can see here a way to try to teach a moral lesson to capitalism, to somehow short circuit, turning money to commodities to more money, but really it only serves its social and cultural purpose if it is turned into something beautiful like this building. Subsequently, this mural was covered up and I think destroyed. Others may know more here about the particulars of it, but I never, within about 30 years, it was gone. The most spectacular of the interiors at One Wall Street is this great reception room that occupies the full depth of the building along Wall Street. So in the plan that I showed you just a moment ago, this is the reception room here. It was entered from Wall Street like this. The Irving Trust Company did not put a typical bank hall, a retail bank hall, at its base. They had plenty of branches all over New York City. Rather, what they had here was a place for their most valued customers to come in, to be met by an employee of the bank, and then to be asked to sit down, and then a phone call would be made, and then whomever they had an appointment with would come down to see them. This was designed by Walker, Mayer, and also a Yale art school professor named Everett Meeks. So Irving Trust went to they spared no expense in trying to get the best design possible here. The walls are coated in glass and mosaic marbles, in abstract, naturalistic patterning, Again, the illustration can hardly do it justice with this amazing veining. This is truly one of the great interior spaces in New York City. I think a case can be made that even though it's much smaller than grand spaces like the old long-gone Penn Station or Grand Central Station, that this reception hall, as well as some of the other banking halls around Wall Street, should be considered as these great early 20th century public spaces for New York City. And this was certainly meant to be a public space, though now I think there's no way you can get in there without passing through security and having very good reasons. So it's lost that purpose, but it was meant to be this grand reception hall and part of the city. A civic gift, in a way, is one way to think about it. Upstairs, very high-fashion boardrooms and executive offices for Irving Trust's personnel. And then at the very top of the building, the director's Great Lounge. It was this multi-story reception space at the very top, which still is more or less in its condition, which you have now. Again, amazing wall patterning, and also this faceted ceiling up above there. Several of Wall Street's skyscrapers had these extraordinary observation lounges at the very top. 40 Wall Street didn't happen to have one, which I think tells us again about its kind of very pragmatic purposes, but Irving Trust Company did. So here we see it in all of its, in some ways, in all of its glory then in a photograph, a more contemporaneous photograph, showing that relationship to Trinity Church. So what can we say then, I think, altogether about this building? Its afterlife was less dramatic, I think, than 40 Wall Street. It became the Bank of New York building, which it was from 1988 to 2007, and then now BNY, Bank of New York Mellon. So it has, in effect, remained within the possession primarily of a banking corporation. The impulse here was to turn wealth into beauty. Cultural capital in this building took its place alongside of money capital as a motivation for the creation here. I think we see that in the attention and care to the architecture. This is a much more unified building, at least in terms of its exterior design. Publicity, image, and spectacle were important. And instead of, and I think with the idea that architecture could be a consolation for the rigors of Wall Street life, both in terms of its luxurious interiors, but also in what Walker wanted to offer to passersby, that mental escape, an opportunity for an aesthetic experience that would slow down time, not to be read at a glance, and that this too was a way in which capitalism, business builds for itself, to offer consolations for the pressures and the risks and that creative destruction that is also seen as being part of it. So I think we have here then, as I've been saying in my conclusion then, a little bit to One Wall Street, two very different structures in a way. One, a speculator's building with a disjointed team of architects creating in some ways a very disjointed building, versus One Wall Street, not built for prestige as much as for speculation. One architect, a designing mind in charge, but still also both striving for height, in terms of its economic viability, striving for height as a way to distinguish itself as a desirable address. And yet, as much as these were monumental buildings, what is also interesting about them is that they don't, and as much as they were about individuality and the individualism of the owners and of the corporations, they still are subsumed within this much larger whole. So I think, too, that even giving an individuality to Wall Street's buildings shouldn't blind us to the fact that they, in some ways, ought to be seen as a whole, and that is also part of the character of Wall Street. I'll say just a little bit about a couple of other buildings here from this time period, some of the most prominent ones. The Equitable Trust Building at the intersection of Broad and Wall Street. I count this as a Wall Street building. It's big enough. So it overwhelms the Morgan Bank building here, so even if it has that Broad Street address, it's part of its known as Broad right there. A smaller building, Siemens Bank building, further down Wall Street by Benjamin Wistar Morris, one of the older architects working in the period here. Really kind of a lovely small building. The two other buildings that I focused on in the Skyscraper Rivals, the Citibank Owners Trust Building, which was taller than One Wall Street, and then the City Service Building, whose designer was Thomas J. George, which is the tallest of these Wall Street skyscrapers. And after the two World Trade Center towers were destroyed, the City Service Building still today is the tallest building in Manhattan. So it really is a landmark. But because of its location towards the east and the north up on Pine Street, even though, as we'll see in a moment from some of the characteristic views of Manhattan, it's kind of it stands out. It's still kind of, I think, kind of lost its place. This, to me, City Service Building is still kind of not just the tallest, but in some ways the most prominent of these buildings. But because it was off on the fringes, it's maybe not received the due that it deserves. So again, this idea that Wall Street forms this whole conglomeration of buildings. In some ways, what we have here then is something very characteristic of capitalism as a mode of production. What I mean by that is, instead of a single guiding mind, whether it be the state or the king or someone like that, what you have in capitalism, ideally, is a lot of individuals making their own decisions about what's in their best interest, right? That's what the market is supposed to be about. And that's what Wall Street produced. A lot of individuals, whether they were corporate individuals or individual developers, all doing what they wanted in their own best interest. And what you get then, in a way, is not a unified place, but in a way what you might think of as a vernacular, almost. It's almost styleless I think, in the anonymity of the whole. Each individual building has a particular character, but again, the whole kind of comes all together like this. No guiding agency except the market, very light zoning regulation, and in some ways then that idea of the spontaneous city that just emerges rather than being designed and planned. City, and I couldn't help showing this aerial view because I love seeing Wall Street in its full perspective. That is, not to look at the individual buildings, but to look at this in terms of the whole metropolitan area. Because something very interesting is happening here, and I'll say this very briefly. At the same time as Wall Street is building up and becoming more congested and more centralized, the metropolitan area is becoming decentralized. And I think we always want to see Wall Street in that way. It's becoming more tight-packed, it's becoming more dense, and yet at the same time, the whole thing is spreading out. And that's not a contradiction that I think we ought to resolve, but it's part of the mechanism. Perhaps one might think of capitalism itself, the accumulation of wealth and capital, and yet at the same time, that urge for growth and expansion, always happening simultaneously, and I think this view shows that. We also want to always understand the life of Wall Street in relationship to the metropolitan area. All these people commuting in, as I said, 500,000 coming into the city, going back out. It should never be seen as isolated buildings or a collection of isolated buildings, but in a metropolitan, at least in a metropolitan scheme. So that's one way to think about this spatially. Now, how did people make sense of Wall Street at this time? And I think here again we see the way in which the architecture here lent itself to seeing it in contradictory ways. Here on the left is a very well-known image, which there's a large reproduction of, the photographer Bernice Abbott's Wall Street district, taken from the top of One Wall Street, tilted at this angle, looking down the street. It's a real jazz age photograph, right? The strong diagonal, the fact that the buildings are cropped and cut off. You get a sense of dynamism, of growth, of action. This is one aspect of the experience and the impressions of Wall Street. Then you have a view by a printmaker named Louis Lozowick called Manhattan Skyline. It's a very different image. It centers on the city service building. It creates this image of Wall Street as monumental, as static, as kind of this fixed object in the landscape. It almost has a kind of a geological quality to it. So these were two equally prominent interpretations of modern skyscraper architecture. Characteristic of dynamism, of the modern age and of capitalism, but at the same time almost natural or geologic, talking about canyons, talking about mountainscapes. This was seen not just as natural but primitive. There was a feeling that these were like Mesoamerican pyramids. This was all part of the same rhetoric. So this again is part of the contradictory aspects that we have here. One, of the dynamism of the economic life and of the building's relationship to each other, and yet a sense, too, that this represents a stable and monolithic and almost immovable system, that this economic system is fixed and rooted. And Lozowick, a socialist, hoped eventually that this mode of production would be owned by the people, but he still was portraying it as this very powerful, very fixed, very stable entity. So again, another contradiction between that dynamism and that sense of immobility and stasis. I want to conclude not so much with looking at these kind of specifically spatial representations of Wall Street, but to talk a little bit about the temporal aspect of it. Because I think that the brilliance of this exhibit here is that for the first time, I think at a serious level, it allows you to look at the span of Wall Street across time. Now, I've just shown Wall Street from the 20s to the early 30s to the late 1990s here. Because so many studies of architecture and architectural history focus on a particular moment in time about the creation of the objects. And we don't usually look at them over a very long period of time. So what I think we see here is something very unusual, one kind of final contradiction to look at about Wall Street's architecture. On the one hand, it follows a very strict economic logic. That is, as a kind of a seeking for the highest value of the land. That is a desire, as the architect of the Woolworth Building, Cass Gilbert, said, to make the land pay. So that the seeking after profit from the land and the space above that land leads to higher and higher buildings. That in some ways remains the underlying logic of Wall Street. And it explains the successive crops of buildings that we see here, that sense of creative destruction, both of the built environment itself and of the enterprises that occupy those buildings. And yet, I think there's both a logic here and something utterly unpredictable and ought to remain surprising to us. That is, Wall Street today looks pretty much the way that it looked 75 years ago, in terms of the scale and the height as you walk down. And that, I think, would have been unthinkable to people in 1935, that Wall Street in 1935, in 2010, would look the way it did in 1935, because the way that Wall Street had looked 75 years before 1935, 1860, was utterly different. And they would have thought, from the logic of development and progress and capitalism, that you would continue to have that fast change. So we should be surprised that Wall Street still looks the same. And that leads to a whole series of unanswered questions, which is, how does capitalism inhabit this place? What have been the forces driving the immobility, the ossification of the built environment here? And also to look to at how yet these buildings have been adapted, because as you know now from walking down Wall Street, there are more signs for these buildings as places to live than there are for them to occupy offices. So that adaptability of capitalists seeking profit out of the built environment, and not just the adaptability, the resilience of these capitalist interests to continue to find value in the built environment. And I think as we enter into another one of capitalism's periodic crises in the last couple of years or so, we do well to attend not just to capitalism's dynamism in periods of growth and explosion, but also its resiliency and adaptability. And I think this temporal look across Wall Street, which this exhibit offers us, is a real way to start to understand how capitalism inhabits and continues to inhabit the built environment. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.